Good morning. I'm happy to greet you in Ukraine Media Center Ukraine Forum. Today is day 289 of the war of Ukraine against Russia. My name is Elena Frolova, and we're having a very interesting event today, dedicated not exclusively to the way Ukraine conducts its warfare, but the way Ukraine sees the victory, and when Ukraine sees its victory, but also how we see Russia after this war. And it's a very principal question, because what Ukrainians understood now, which Ukrainians have realized now, like, yeah, we don't wanna do anything with Russia, but if Russia does not undergo changes, we will always end up in a cycle of these events going on in Ukraine, that Ukraine suffers, that the whole world suffers today. Our speakers today are Isa Akayev, commander of the Crimea Volunteer Battalion, Alexander Fortuna, Chief of Staff of the Russian Volunteer Corps, and Denis Sokolov, the representative of a civil council. He's joining us online. We've selected this topic, the sunset of an empire, how the peoples of Russia will exercise the right for self-determination after the victory of Ukraine. Just a small reference, Crimea Battalion is the reconnaissance battalion which is involved in war starting from 2014. It's manned by the Crimean Tatars, Chechens, and other peoples of the Caucasus. Russian Volunteer Corps is something that Mr. Alexander will tell us about maybe later, and the Civil Council are the leaders of the National Republican movements, which from Russian Federation. They joined their efforts with the Russian Volunteer Corps for fighting Putin's regime in Russia. So let's start. Let's start with how we see the victory and when do we see the victory. And it's interesting to hear this opinion from somebody who are in the front lines and who know better what's going on. Mr. Issa, let's start with you maybe. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for availing myself of this opportunity to express my opinion. I wish the soonest victory to all of us. I wish everybody health and peaceful skies to all of us, and all of our warriors to come back home alive. And first of all, I would like to say that the future of Russia after our victory is very important to us, because just like you mentioned, for the time being, if Russia remains the way it is, what happened to us on the 24th of February, it will keep coming back. It's clearly evident from the history. So for the time being, me and my guys who want to support the reformation of Russia in future and creation of national states on the territory of modern Russian Federation, the way they will call ourselves, it completely depends on them. But moving in that direction, in general, well, this is the way. Mr. Alexander, could you please comment first of all, how do you see the Ukrainian victory? What does it mean to you, and what's your motivation to join the armed forces of Ukraine now, and do you believe that Russia may look different? Well, first of all, I want to support my colleague's words. We share the same opinion. Ukrainians' victory is first of all the return of all the occupied territories. It's the measures taken in the area of tribunals, trials, and punishment of all the guilty, with payment of further reparations to Ukraine. And that will put a period in this war. When all these measures are already taken, we could say with confidence that we achieved victory. But the second aspect is that Russia will not go anywhere. And will it be the future of Russian Federation, or will it be another state or a couple of states? It will be a neighbor, always living nearby, and Ukraine will have to coexist with it. And the parallel task, along with everything directed at victory now, it's necessary to participate in the future reconstruction of that country, so it becomes the most comfortable neighbor, not only to Ukraine but to the other states as well, other neighboring states. So how do you see, well, what are the options? The most of experts, they share the opinion that now there are no national movements observed. The policy of Russia was built in a way that all the nations who live in that country, they completely lost the sense of self-identity, self-national identity. They don't have self-identity. There are no leaders who could have moved such, who could have pushed, propelled such movements. Do you think that this internal riot is still possible? Well, I don't completely agree with this opinion. Russia is a big blanket made of pieces. It's made up of monolithic ethnic formations, and within the last 20 years there was a political nation created called the Russians, just like in where they tried, just like in Soviet Union, to mix up everything and to depreciate some national identities. But we know for sure that there are republics which are ethnically homogeneous, and if anything starts, it will start there. Well, probably, yeah, there will be some protests going on, some aspiration to separate by national identity. But as to the rest of the things, I think that the titular nation is not ready for that in Russia. So there is no demand on part of the people for any changes. So I think this ethnic component, it comes separately, and the rest is only external influence. Mr. Denis, are you with us? Yes, I'm with you. I'm right here. Could you please comment? You represent mostly the political opinion, political views on what's going on. Do you understand Ukrainian language? Well, I understand you, but I will answer in Russian. Well, if the people of Russia is not ready to critical changes in their policies, in their politics of state building, is there any chance for any national movements to be successful? I think that there is a chance, and I think that our political task is to provide an option for the peoples inhabiting Russian Federation, giving them the opportunity for self-determination, self-rule. And under self-rule of the society, I understand the decolonization not only of national republics, but of a large number of Russian communities scattered around Russian Federation, save for the national republics where the majority of the population is non-Russian, and which are colonized in the same way as the other peoples, because Russians are now oppressed. I agree with Alexander that the identity is replaced with imperial patterns which render Russians absolutely incapable of political self-identity and oppression of political subjectivity, and it was one of the tasks of the existing regime, if we to take into account some continuity of imperial structures within the hundreds of years. And our task is to break this vicious cycle and to decolonize national republics and all the peoples inhabiting Russian Federation, which were colonized and joined to the empire, annexed by the empire, and their national development was oppressed. But the Russian communities should be also provided this opportunity, and it's important what Isa mentioned when we proposed the name for the conference. It's important for the empire to end not only for Chechens and Tatars, Kalmyks. It's important to end the empire for Russians. The regions have to get the broad autonomy to be able to develop the national identity, cultural identity. When we talk about Russians, we're talking about a conglomerate of a number of ethnic and sub-ethnic groups, which today, after the victory of Ukraine and after liquidation of this existing political class ruling Russia right now, that they can get this opportunity for development. It's very important now for the regional movements, the regional resistant movements to exist, and it's important to eliminate the existing political class existing in Russia now. I'm talking about law enforcement agencies and courts. We have to replace the political class, and there is the risk of riot. So talking about the national republics, we can say that there are leaders, but still there are differences, complications, and there is a political process, there is competition. In the regions which are considered Russians, it's not always that they have some political leaders who are ready to talk about some subjectivity. And it's surprising, but war will help us in this regard. It will create the political class. Those Russians who talk about anti-war initiatives, whether you can or cannot kill the Russians, if they are the Russians who will start rebuilding their country, who will start removing the existing regime now, I understand that there are people in the studio, and Alexander represents the people who already have been doing it, and the gratitude is infinite, because if it's not for them that they conquer with their efforts and their blood, if they don't win that right for us to speak now, because we can only hope that you will recognize us as somebody useful. So it's war that should create the political class. If it doesn't, today we can end up on another vicious cycle. It will be for Russians. I understand that the number of national republics will get free after the victory of Ukraine, but the issue is still very difficult for the Russians. The most of the discussion going on among Ukrainian experts about the scenarios of what would be going on in Russia, what will happen in Russia. So the only signs of possible separation are only demonstrated in the regions which are self-sufficient in terms of economy and which have some regional political elite like Ural and a couple of other regions. Do you think that really among the regional political elite there are people who would be able to, well, we all hope that after the victory of Ukraine, Russia will end up in political crisis, so such people who could be able to activate this resistance agenda inside Russia? Yes, I confirm the answer is yes. We feel it because more than 10 regions already got joined to our projects, and it's not only the regions of Caucasus, those are the regions around Ural River, and the experts are right that the first regions to join this process will be self-sufficient, economically self-sufficient regions who feel mostly how colonized are they, how Moscow doesn't let them develop. Yeah, it's so. And we hope that maybe 15, 20 regions will be a locomotive in this process who will pull the rest of the country after them. I'm talking about the Russian regions. The situation with national republics is a little bit different. Mr. Alexander, could you please tell us, in your imagination, how do you see the perfect, the ideal Russia? Do you see the role of those people who are in the front lines by your side? Do you see a role for them in rebuilding, in the reformation of Russia and creation of a new political class? Well, everybody likes talking about great Russia of the future, so if we still call it Russia, so I think that first of all it should be a country where the rights of the Russians should in no way be violated and brought to zero, just like it is now in Russian Federation. So Russian in Russian Federation is the most depraved element of population. Now, there are some preferences for other nationalities. There are some steps ahead from the government, but no Russian can do in Russia. No Russian can create a civil organization. If you come to the government saying like we're Russians and we want to create a Russian patriotic council or philatelist group, it will be considered extremism just because there is a word Russian in that name. It's the upside down, it's a capsized story, and this paradigm, it must change. We can get deeper into some fantastic versions of what the country should look like. I know exactly what it shouldn't look like. We should get away from the impunity of the government, of the freedom of degradation present to the full extent. Now we have to move away from the from what government is doing now, and we should see the equality for everybody, for all the layers of population, all the strata, including in ethnical terms, and then we will see how it looks further on. So those are the things that should disappear. Mr. Akayev, I would like to get back to the terms of victory, and how do you see the development of the war next year? There's a lot of discussions about returning of Crimea, about reintegration of Crimea. What is felt inside of your battalion? What do people talk about? There is no doubt Crimea is coming back. As to the terms, well, when it will happen, we don't have enough information, for example, available to the higher command of our armed forces. And secondly, there is a number of external factors, something that depends on our partners, of our allies who support us in this fight for freedom and independence. So coming back to words of Alexander, actually here in Ukraine today, the future not only of Russia and Russian people is being decided, is the future of the peoples of Ural and Caucasus and everybody who inhabits this formation called Russian Federation, because with today's events we've shown to everybody, to all serious countries who considered Russia one of the biggest countries, one of the most powerful countries in the world, the so-called second army, we showed everybody that it's so bubble. But let's not get too flattered, and let's not think that we've did everything we should have done, because even after the war ends there will be a lot of work to do to have that country in future, just like my brother just mentioned. to have this country built in a way comfortable for those who live in there and for the neighbors, no matter how it would be called. And mentioning Denis, like he mentioned that the national states should be getting maximum autonomy. So they not only should be autonomous, but every people who inhabit that state, they should decide whether they want to be a part of confederation, no matter how it would be called in future, or they want to live separately and build their relations with their neighbors. It's up to the people to decide, because for the time being, judging by the policies of the Russian government, I have an impression, or I'm convinced, that Russians is no nationality, it's the ideology, some political doctrine. So Russian is no nationality. It's the imposition of the ideology, just like any other ideology existing today. So the Russians, they were transformed into ideology. It was deprived of national identity. It was deprived of national mental expressions. It was just turned into ideology, which now they try to impose on the on everybody. So we have to bring it back to the condition where to that condition it should be in. The Russian is a nationality. There is a criteria to define it. So talking about ideology, well, it should be transferred from ideology to nationality. Denis, my opinion and the opinion of many other experts is that liberation of Crimea for Russia will be a trigger which will launch the internal processes, because Crimea was assigned some sacral meaning for Russian political elite. Do you have such feeling? Actually, how do you evaluate the situation, and what will be the reaction for liberation of liberation of Crimea? Well, because not all of, but many Western partners are afraid that it will result in application of nuclear weapons, or it will result in some processes inside Russia, some dangerous processes. I think that liberation of Crimea is inevitable, and it will result in tectonic moves inside of Russia, but it will more concern Russian elite, because many of them think that everything can be played back, nothing special is going on. They still live in the same world they were living before 24th of February, when they started this cowardly war. They don't understand what's going on, and obviously liberation of Crimea should make an impression, and the number of people who realize that the war is lost, and Putin and his clique pulled everybody in this catastrophe. I don't think that it may change the mood inside, like in this deep people, as they call it, because the deep people have no moods at all. They atrophied, but the number of allies and the rats who flee the ship, it will be quite big. We were expecting for some tectonic changes after the first defeat of Russia, but I think that Crimea will have better effect, and I would not stop. I would not be flattered that liberation of Crimea would result in disintegration of federation right here and right now. I think that it's just one of the benchmarks, one of the important steps on the way for the Russian Federation to stop being that aggressor and dangerous neighbor they are now. And I would like to add and detailize a little bit with my reaction to the words of esteemed Isa, I was talking about the autonomy of Russian regions and national republics who de jure and de facto should have the right to self-determination. So we're talking about the reconfiguration of the political space, and we understand that self-determination of the peoples is in the is a fundamental to this reformation. It's not like somebody provides this autonomy, but the sovereignty, it exists de facto at the moment of the end of the war. Alexander, do you maintain any connections with your friends in Russia? Is there any insider information? What's felt inside Russia? Well, actually, the percent is very low of those with whom I maintain any connections. So those are like some pals, friends, acquaintances, but the majority of the people whom I communicated with before the war, it does not exist now. There are some persons I communicate with now, but generally no. Well, and is there a feeling that there is that those last strikes in the depth of Russia, do they change this feeling of this mysterious deep people we're talking about now? That the war is coming closer to them. Well, yeah, it's an interesting question because to answer it, you have to live many years in Russia, and you have to know some basic principles of psychology of a simple people who live in the regions or live somewhere in the depth of Russia. To have some tectonic move in the minds of the people, there should be something happening that touches them. If it doesn't touch them, if you ask somebody living in Siberia what's about the war in Ukraine or the war on Mars, they would have been equal, because it's something very far from them, and it's not something concerning them. When people will have power shut down, water supply shut down, something will be burning, something will be exploding right by their side. Yeah, they will start having some demand to the government, and they will start asking why are there troops of Russia in the territory of Ukraine, because there's a flip side of the coin, and that will be a point, the breaking point for the beginning of some movements. Denise, what's your opinion in this regard? Are there such feelings, are there such moods in the Russian Federation among the people that the war coming to their lands? Well, it's surprising, but the explosion in the Crimea bridge created some panic, and many citizens of St. Petersburg or Far East, they got the understanding that something's going on in the wrong way. Because this story only concerned those who were following the war and those who were not. Just like Alexander mentioned, they just didn't notice anything, but the picture with the burning bridge, it became something that created reaction even in that deep people. But people, they don't think, the simple people and even somebody whom we call elite, they will try to sort things out by themselves, and they should be offered some alternative before we propose an alternative. Now this alternative is only brought on the bayonets. Now people are afraid of this regime. People are afraid of the special services. The aggression is the product of fear. The population is intimidated so bad that they don't even realize they are intimidated. And this in-depth fear and the cause of this hatred to the world is this deep-seated fear which should be cured. And the only cure is making them brave. So so this job now done by the Russian volunteer battalion, the armed forces of Ukraine is the only effective cure. The only effective cure is to have somebody become courageous. I think Aristotle said that slavery only exists that some people are ready to be slaves. They agree to be slaves. So the problem is that because of the fear, the vast part of the population of Russia agreed to be slaves, and this is our biggest problem, because without seizing this agreement, talking about Russian nation, well, it's quite complicated. Nation are those who are ready not to be slaves and who are ready to fight for their freedom, for their liberty. Well, the alternative brought on the bayonets is an interesting aspect. It's maybe it will be our last question maybe, and then we will give an opportunity to the journalists in the studio to ask their questions. Do I understand it right that you have a feeling that this external alternative should have been proposed by alternative and the Western world rather than to grow from inside grow from inside of the Russian resistance, maybe not so even numerous? The external alternative should be supported by the Western world. It's been already proposed by Ukrainian. Well, but it should be proposed by the Russians, because the fear of this sledgehammer shown on the TV, the Prigozhin sledgehammer, it nails all the other feelings. So this sledgehammer made more impression inside of Russia rather than outside, and it was offered to the people who think not about alternative, but those people were thinking that they can sit around for a while and wait for everything to end. So the sledgehammer is not gonna go anywhere. It will reach everybody. So no matter how numerous it will be, 1, 2, 3% of the population, it may be a very small number of people. If there will be a political class which amounts to 1 million, which is less than 1%, still 1 million is a lot. Well, thank you. Thank you. It's very important, and I don't think that anybody in Ukraine believes that Russia may be changed by somebody from the outside. I think that Russia may only be changed from the inside, and the experience of formation of Ukrainian nation shows that there is a work to be, you have to do yourself. Alexander, and finishing like before the Q&A session, do you fight for Russia now or do you fight for Ukraine? Well, we fight on Ukrainian side against the political regime existing now in Russia. We are, in a regular sense, servicemen. All the members of Russian Volunteer Corps are in the front lines, well, save for the rotated personnel, but we are as well political soldiers. There is a parallel process. And for us, this war is for Ukraine against the enemy, who is now represented by Russian Federation. And secondly, it's the continuation of the war, which resulted in all of us being here now with that same old enemy who already removed all the masks. Thank you very much. Let's proceed to the questions from the studio, if there are any. The question will be probably to Mr. Alexander and Mr. Denis. We understand that all the experts and maybe the majority of Ukrainians understand that most likely the disintegration of Russia is an inevitable story. It's only the matter of time. And you mentioned that it may happen, or it may start from some regions or some ethnical groups. So who, in your opinion, may become a leader in this process? Who will be the first? Well, who is answering first? Well, depends on how comfortable it is for you. Well, what we're seeing in the surface now, we're seeing Chechens, and Chechens were fighting for their independence back in 19th, and we understand that Chechens is the only people in Russia and in Northern Caucasus who were fighting for their independence with their arms in their hands. They were shedding their blood, and it's an obvious story that back in 90s they started, and now they continue the war for their independence. And I think that other regions and national republics, I'm not talking about Crimea. Crimea is obviously Ukraine. We put Crimea behind the brackets, and as to other regions, Moscow should lose control of the situation, and it should probably happen from the inside, and I would not give the leadership to other peoples or regions. I think that it's very important for a number of Russian regions in Siberia, in the west, to have them demand independence with the arms in their hands. Otherwise, it would be very difficult to imagine the disintegration of Russia without some big civil war, which will result in such disintegration. Alexander, I completely agree with Denise in this regard. I would just like to amend that it's too early to say about some very expressed demonstrative leadership. We're talking about disintegration, but nobody says about what's gonna be happening after that. And provoking this disintegration, I'm just afraid that it may result in something worse. Everybody wants the same. Everybody wants Russia to disintegrate in some comfortable way, and for a number of democratic states to emerge in that territory, but unfortunately it's impossible. If it all results in a full-scale civil war, I'm afraid it could have been even worse than it is now, because it will be very difficult situation in the borders, and it will not be the end of war in Russia. So now the task is to create the mechanism to build the system, and whoever will manage this system, the time will show. So we're talking about alternative now, but it's still intangible. So we meet, we discuss, we talk about it. So this subject is in the air. Many people start pondering over it, but there is no ready mechanism for growing this mechanism from zero. When there will be idea of such mechanism, any sane, any reasonable person may become a head of such autonomy. Any more questions? Good afternoon, dear heroes. Mr. Isa, good afternoon, good morning, Alexander. I am the head of Jazz Cocktail Festival. My name is Kirill Manarich, and we were trying to do things with Al Jazeera. I'm making projects with different media, and I have questions as the professional professional cultural manager and a helper to the journalist. How should we act with the cultural actors? How do you see? What should we do with the cultural front? Russian or some other indefinite things. For example, I had a story with Boris Grebenshchikov. I was trying to convince him a lot to have a performance at the festival, but I was eventually able to convince him, and now his position is somewhere in between. How should we fight in Russia with the help of the cultural actors? Do we do it on the platform of derussification and abdication of imperial Russian ideology? Very good question. Thank you for this question. I will respond it in a way you're not gonna like, most likely. You know, everybody tries to have this story with the cultural actors to build it in a way that those are people who don't have a determinate position, or they're above the fight, but it's not something that can happen in the real world. So when the war ends, there will be two categories of people: guilty of war and non-guilty of war. So I can tell you who are not guilty of war. So those who took up the arms and stood on the Ukrainian side, they are non-guilty, and some prisoners of conscience or people in exile, they're non-guilty, or people who suffered already some loss to their moral strength, to their health, their property, their liberty, their freedom, who already suffered from this regime, and that there is a large number of political prisoners of Ukraine. So most likely there will be no questions to those people. And to those who, for example, left and support Ukraine from outside, there's some media personalities, cultural actors who stand against Russian aggression, who support not only with word but with some action. Somebody supports the army, somebody creates the projects, certain projects, and the rest of the people will be guilty. It's not because I want it or Isa wants it, but it will be the general opinion. There are those who directly support. Many names can be called, but it's redundant. And there are people who say we have nothing to do with that. We're not concerned with this. So I think that Mr. Grebenshikov will be assigned to that category, unfortunately. Mr. Denis, do you want to add anything? I agree with Alexander 100%. Maybe it makes sense talking about culture, the culture which has been imposed in Russia by the regime. For the time being, it should have been eliminated, destroyed to the ground, because this imperial culture imposed from the very young age, from school, the culture of aggressiveness, and the cultural actors who participate in that, I don't know, they are on the brink of illustration and condemnation, or they should be subject to conviction, because it's very harmful what they're doing. Any more questions, dear friends? Well, then I will wrap up our conversation. Thank you for this comprehensive discussion. Honestly, I have a huge respect to Alexander and all the Russians who are now fighting for Ukraine. At least you've already fought your right for the free life. I respect those who fight in the front lines and outside the front lines. Unfortunately, we don't see a huge number of such people, but I honestly hope and I wish all the political nation of Russia to get rid of this imperial gene. I have a doubt that such transformation will happen, but on my end, I hope that the armed forces of Ukraine, including you, do everything possible for this to happen. And then it will be up to the people of Russia. They will be able to undergo the transformation, to choose a different way, to choose something else, and we will do our own. Thank you. If you have anything to add, you can say it now. Thank you, Denise. Thank you. Thank you.